You know that feeling, right? Pulling out a shirt, maybe just back from the dry cleaner or warm from your own dryer.
Yeah, that fresh, crisp feel.
Exactly. It feels, well, clean, ready to wear. We all kind of take it for granted.
Hmm.
But what if the actual process of getting our clothes that clean had hidden costs? I mean, not just money, but costs for, our health and the environment.
It's definitely a classic case of out of sight, out of mind, isn't it? We use these services, buy these products all the time.
Right.
But our sources, they really pull back the curtain on, well, the whole story behind that cleanliness.
Yeah.
And there are some surprising downsides.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, we've gathered quite a stack of sources. We've got insights from folks actually working in the dry cleaning industry, some pretty dense scientific studies on chemical exposure.
Yeah, and news reports talking about like widespread pollution issues, plus articles looking at sustainability and even what's going on with our laundry at home.
So our mission here, it's pretty straightforward, but I think really crucial. We want to unpack what these sources are telling us.
Right, about the chemicals they use, the risks involved, not just for workers, right, but for whole communities, the environment.
Yeah, the challenges the industry is facing, and maybe most importantly, the hunt for safer, more sustainable ways to actually get clothes clean.
And this really does connect directly to you, the listener. It touches on the businesses you might use, the environment where you live.
And kind of surprisingly, maybe even the air you're breathing right inside your own house.
Okay, so let's dive in. We should probably start with the chemical that's really been the workhorse of commercial dry cleaning for decades, perchloroethylene.
Right, per coach. Our sources describe it as a colorless liquid, a volatile organic solvent. And it's been huge. Like the main solvent used by maybe 80% of dry cleaners in the US and Canada for a really long time.
And there's a solid reason for that. It's just really, really effective, especially as a degreaser. We saw that come up in a discussion we looked at from a dry cleaner operator. He was actually pretty nervous about switching away from Perc because
Yeah.
it works so well on tough stuff, like oil stains, particularly on wool or formal wear. It just,
It definitely works on the clothes, yeah. But here's where the sources get pretty stark. The documented dangers of percs, they're significant.
Mm-hmm.
You've got big agencies, the EPA, IOH, NTP, IRC. These are major players in health and safety.
Right. The Environmental Protection Agency, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health.
Exactly. And they all flag perc as, well, highly problematic.
Yeah, the EPA calls it a toxic air pollutant.
Hmm.
NOH says it's a potential occupational carcinogen.
Potential, okay.
The National Toxicology Program, you see, it's reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen. And IRRC, they classify it as a probable human carcinogen.
Wow. That's like a four-agency consensus pointing towards cancer risk, especially for workers, right? The ones with long-term exposure.
That's the biggest concern, yeah.
Hmm.
But it's not just cancer. High levels can cause immediate problems, dizziness, headaches, even passing out.
Both.
And what really stood out in the research for me was one of the most dangerous non-cancer effects. Serious nerve and brain damage from exposure. It's potent stuff.
Potent chemical, potent downsides. And those downsides, they really spread out, don't they? Far beyond just the dry cleaning shop itself, Perc leaves a big environmental footprint.
A very persistent one. This is where the pollution problem really kicks in. See, before they had better equipment and, frankly, stricter rules.
Yeah.
Perc often got mishandled, spilled maybe,
Yeah.
sometimes even just dumped down the drain. And because it's a liquid but also volatile, it can seep right through stuff like concrete floors.
Down into the ground.
Exactly, into the soil, then the groundwater.
Yeah.
And it doesn't just stay put, it moves, it spreads underground in these things called persistent plumes.
Plumes. Okay.
One source used California as a really stark example. They estimated that pollution just from dry cleaners has created a statewide cleanup problem costing, well, billions.
Billions. With a B. That's huge for what seems like a local business issue.
It is staggering. Look at Lake Tahoe. One report mentioned finding Perc pollution in the groundwater there.
Oh, no.
At levels over 1,000 times the EPA's health limits. And that plume, it's moving towards the lake itself.
1,000 times the limit near Lake Tahoe. Wow, that really hits home how persistent and dangerous this stuff is. And you mentioned something called vapor intrusion.
Yes, that's another really critical piece here. Because Perc is volatile, it can actually evaporate from that contaminated soil and groundwater,
Back up.
back up into the air, and then it can seep into nearby buildings. Think schools, daycares, homes, hospitals, retirement homes, places near these contaminated sites. So the underground problem literally becomes an indoor air quality problem.
So the pollution plume isn't just in the water, it can affect the air people are breathing inside, maybe years or decades later. That sounds incredibly difficult to fix.
It is. And the sources that detail the cleanup challenges, they're pretty sobering.
How so?
Well, take California again.
Yeah.
There's just nowhere near enough dedicated state funding for the sheer scale of this. The estimates for cleaning up just the dry cleaner sites, they range from maybe $7.5 billion dollars up to $100 billion.
100 billion. Wait, and you said the state water board's budget for dealing with all kinds of plumes is only, what, 34 million a year?
Right. So you do the math.
Yeah.
It's almost unbelievable. At that funding level, it could take anywhere from like 220 years to nearly 3,000 years
3,000 years.
just to fund the cleanup needed for the estimated 10,000 plus contaminated dry cleaner sites in California alone. It's a massive legacy problem.
And a lot of these places are small businesses, right? Family owned, maybe. They can't possibly handle costs like that.
No way. They often can't afford the millions it might take for a cleanup. One owner interviewed described the situation for some businesses stuck with this as basically ticking time bombs. They might have inherited this huge environmental liability they just can't fix.
It's good to see some policy changes, though. Like California banning perc use in dry cleaning from 2023. That pushes alternatives, and the EPA might do a nationwide ban.
Yeah, those are really essential steps to stop new pollution. But the sources are clear. Even if the use stops, cleaning up decades of this legacy contamination, that remains this monumental task. Huge costs, huge timelines.
Okay, so that's perc. Let's talk about another chemical that came up, closely related. TCE.
Right, trichloroethylene, TCE. It's like Perc's chemical cousin, shares some similar properties, and it also had a long history of use, not just in some older dry cleaning methods, but way more broadly.
Like what?
Industrial degreasing, cleaning engines, even some surprising uses historically in medicine, believe it or not.
Huh. And like perc, it's a common pollutant.
Very common. Our sources highlight it's found in maybe up to a third of U.S. groundwater. It's at tons of toxic Superfund sites. And it's notorious for contaminating military bases like Camp Lejeune.
Camp Lejeune, right.
And this is where the research points to a particularly, alarming connection. A paper discussed by the URMC newsroom. They presented what they called a compelling link between TCE exposure and Parkinson's disease.
Parkinson's. Wow, I hadn't connected these kinds of solvents to Parkinson's at all.
The research they cited is pretty specific. It associates TCE exposure with something like a 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's.
500%. That's huge.
It is. And animal studies seem to show how it happens. TCE gets into the brain, it damages the mitochondria, the energy factories in our cells.
Right.
And it specifically causes loss of the nerve cells that produce dopamine. And losing those cells, that's a classic hallmark of Parkinson's disease in humans.
So there's a plausible biological mechanism there suggested by the research.
Exactly. And while people working directly with TCE clearly had a higher risk, the authors are worried about potentially millions more. People who might have encountered it without even knowing.
Without knowing.
What?
Like the vapor intrusion thing with perc?
Precisely that. Breathing contaminated air, drinking contaminated water, or living or working in buildings where TCE vapors are intruding from below ground.
Right.
The article shared some really powerful stories to illustrate this. There was NBA player Brian Grant, diagnosed with Parkinson's young at 36. They believe his exposure might have happened as a kid at Camp Lejeune.
Oh, wow.
And Amy Lindbergh, a Navy officer also exposed there, diagnosed decades later. And even the late Senator Johnny Isaacson, his exposure was linked to using TCE to degrease airplanes back when he was in the Air National Guard.
The fact that symptoms can show up decades after exposure, that must make it incredibly hard to pin down the true scale of this link.
It makes it really difficult to draw that direct cause and effect line for individuals.
Yeah.
But the evidence seems to be building. And this research certainly adds urgency to the calls for action.
Like what?
Like speeding up the cleanup of these contaminated sites, monitoring more closely for these chemicals, and really ending their use where they're still allowed. Some states have banned TCE already, but the EPA itself found it still poses an unreasonable risk in ongoing uses like vapor degreasing.
Okay, so with these really serious risks from perc and TCE becoming clearer, the push for safer alternatives in commercial cleaning makes total sense. What did the sources say about the options?
Well, it was interesting to see the dry cleaners themselves discussing this, like in that Reddit thread we looked at. They're really weighing the pros and cons of different solvents now.
What kinds of things came up?
hydrocarbon solvents, like one called DF2000. A user there said it performed pretty well, but maybe needed a bit more work up front, like pre-spotting stains,
Okay, more labor intensive, perhaps.
potentially. Another one was System K4, made by Chrysler. One professional seemed to prefer it over DF2000 for degreasing. But others worried about how it handled colors, maybe causing bleeding or reacting badly with newer fabrics that have spandex or elastic in them. And that's a big deal if you're cleaning, say, modern formal wear like the original poster was focused on.
Yeah, you can't have clothes coming back damaged or faded. That's key.
Absolutely. Right. The solvent that the original poster, the one asking for advice, seemed to finally settle on trying was called Intense by a company named Sites.
Intense. Okay.
Another user really praised it, called it an amazing solvent, said it was very gentle on clothes, gave him a great feel or touch. The key, they noted, was using the right soap with it.
Huh. It's fascinating getting that kind of on-the-ground perspective, you know? Cleaners figuring out these technical trade-offs in real time.
It really is. And beyond just swapping solvents, the sources also pointed to wet cleaning as a really significant alternative.
Wet cleaning. Does that just mean washing with water? Because that sounds too simple for dry clean-only stuff.
It sounds simple, but it's actually much more sophisticated. Yes, it uses water and special detergents, but the key is the equipment. It's highly computer controlled.
Ah.
These machines precisely manage water temperature, how much the clothes are tumbled, the humidity, everything needed to clean delicate items safely. And then there's specialized pressing and finishing equipment to reshape things properly and stop shrinking. Crucial for suits or dresses.
Okay, so definitely not your home washing machine. What about the environmental side?
That's a big plus. The used water, unlike the waste from Perc or TCE cleaning, doesn't contain those hazardous chemicals. So disposal is much easier and safer. It's also often more energy efficient than systems that need complex solvent recovery processes.
Sounds like a good direction, but is it easy for businesses to make that switch?
Not always. The sources mention it can mean a big investment in new machines, plus needing different skills, retraining staff, and some other alternatives out there, like using liquid CO2, which wasn't covered much in our sources, but it is an option, can just be too expensive, especially for smaller independent shops.
So it adds another pressure point for the industry, which is already dealing with things like, people dressing more casually, less need for traditional dry cleaning.
Exactly. Changes in work habits, remote work, it all adds up.
Okay, so we've covered the big industrial set, the chemicals, the legacy pollution, but the hidden costs of clean clothes, they aren't just at the dry cleaners. Let's pivot now closer to home. What's going on in, your own laundry room?
Yeah, this part from the sources was particularly eye-opening for me. One article actually called it wearable air pollution.
Wearable air pollution? What on earth does that mean?
It's talking about VOC's volatile organic compounds, specifically the ones released from the fragrances that are added to tons of common household laundry products, detergents, dryer sheets.
You mean like the spring fresh or mountain rain scent we associate with clean laundry?
That exact scent. A study mentioned in our sources actually tested the air coming out of dryer vents when using these fragrance products.
And
They found over 25 different VOCs. And here's the kicker. 7 of those are classified by the EPA as hazardous air pollutants.
7 hazardous air pollutants just from drying clothes at home. That's wild.
And it includes some really concerning ones like benzene and acetaldehyde.
Yeah.
The EPA classifies both as probable carcinogens.
Probable carcinogens.
And the EPA explicitly states there's really no safe level of exposure for chemicals like that.
No safe level. And they're coming out of our dryer vents.
That's what the research suggests.
Yeah.
And just to give you a sense of the scale, they estimated the amount of just acetaldehyde released from household dryers in the Seattle area was roughly the same as the acetaldehyde emissions from about 6% of all the cars in that region.
Wow. Okay, that puts it in perspective. That's a significant amount of pollution from something most of us do, multiple times a week without a second thought. What about health effects?
Well, VOCs in general are known to potentially affect multiple systems: nervous system, respiratory system, immune system, even liver and kidneys. That's for anyone exposed.
And the source mentioned chemically sensitive people, like they react more.
Exactly. They might experience symptoms like headaches or breathing problems more quickly or intensely.
Yeah.
The article kind of described them as being like canaries in the coal mine.
Ah, like an early warning sign.
Right. Indicating there's an issue that could affect everyone, even if most people don't have immediate, obvious reactions.
And is it just the air coming out the vent outside? Or is there more to it?
That's another key point from the source. It's not just while drying. The clothes themselves continue to release these VOCs after they're done. They off-gas.
So when you wear the clothes.
Right. As you wear that freshly laundered shirt or you sleep in those sheets, you and anyone close by are still being exposed to those lingering VOCs.
So that familiar clean clothes smell might actually be a cocktail of volatile organic compounds, some potentially hazardous. That really changes how you think about clean, doesn't it?
It really does. But look, the good news here is the sources also offer some pretty simple ways for you to reduce this exposure at home.
Okay, like what? Practical steps.
Yeah, one of the main things is just choosing laundry products without added fragrances. Look for ones labeled free and clear or scent-free.
Makes sense.
Air drying clothes when you can. That completely eliminates the dryer vent emissions. Plus, it saves energy. Win-win.
True.
And if you want softening or less static without the scented dryer sheets, there are alternatives. Things like wool dryer balls or adding a bit of baking soda or vinegar to the wash cycle.
Okay, so relatively easy changes in habits could actually make a difference to the air quality in and around your home.
Seems like it, yeah.
So pulling this all together, from the commercial dry cleaners using Perc and TCE to our own laundry rooms venting VOCs. It really seems like the ways we clean clothes, both big scale and small scale, have these significant environmental and potentially health costs attached.
It really connects those dots, doesn't it? The big industrial chemical problems, the worker safety issues, the massive legacy pollution, right down to the maybe more subtle but still widespread issue of indoor air quality linked to products we use every day.
And that leads naturally into the whole discussion about sustainability, right?
Yeah.
Our sources touched on efforts happening in the laundromat industry, too. They face similar issues with high water and energy use, chemicals.
Yeah, sustainable practices there are all about tackling those impacts head-on, reducing water waste, using more energy-efficient machines, choosing greener detergents when possible.
And technology seems to be helping drive that shift.
Definitely. There's specialized software now for laundromats, for instance. It helps owners track exactly how much water and energy they're using, optimize how the machines run, even go paperless.
Yeah.
Some systems can even, show customers the environmental impact of their choices or suggest more sustainable ways to do their laundry.
That's interesting. The sources also mention cashless payment systems like PayRange. How does that fit in?
Well, partly by cutting down on paper waste from receipts and stuff, but also potentially by allowing better remote management of machines, which could help optimize energy use across the whole facility.
Right. So it's this combination of tech plus presumably more customers actually wanting greener options.
Exactly. That growing consumer demand for environmentally responsible services seems to be a real driver. It's pushing the industry forward, even with those big hurdles like the cost of new equipment. And for dry cleaning, that enormous legacy pollution cleanup challenge.
Okay, so we have covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started with the chemical backbone of old-school dry cleaning, Perc, and uncovered its widespread pollution legacy and health risks. Then TCE and that really concerning link to Parkinson's.
Then we looked at how the industry is searching for safer ways, those alternatives like wet cleaning and the newer solvents they're trying out.
And finally, we brought it right into your home, uncovering that surprising issue of hidden air pollution from everyday laundry products.
It's really clear, isn't it? Cleaning our clothes is a basic necessity, but the methods we've traditionally used, and even some we use now, have these really far-reaching consequences for our health, for our communities dealing with pollution, for the environment as a whole.
And now, hopefully, you feel a bit more informed about these complexities. You're equipped to maybe think about the products you buy, the services you use, in a slightly different way.
Which kind of brings us to a final thought, something for you to chew on. Given that we've seen documented health and environmental impacts from both heavy-duty commercial cleaning chemicals and common household laundry stuff, how much of that true cost of clean, beyond just the price tag, really factor into our choices?
Right, and what responsibility do we share as consumers, as businesses, in pushing for a future where getting clean clothes doesn't come with such a high price for our health or the planet?